Welcome to our third Inside the Truck YouTube. I'm Steve. He's Paul. Today we're going to talk about NHL Return to Play. Does NHL Return to Play, should that have a question mark there, buddy? Because I'm not convinced that this is going to happen.
I'm thinking multiple question marks, Steve, and
Hmm.
perhaps with every day that slides into December, add another question mark. Uh, but one thing that blows me away is it's only been 2 months since they handed out the Stanley Cup. I don't know about you, but it feels way longer than that.
It feels like about 6 months, maybe to me, a year since we saw Steven Stamkos get the cup on that giant wide shot. Who doesn't love a giant wide shot for the cup presentation? It does seem like a long time, but you know what? I guess it's just because everybody has a billion other things on their mind, and hockey's important, but I guess maybe not as important as it was before.
Well, agreed on. There's many more important things going on in the world right now, but if we focus on the NHL return to play, I'm a little bit stunned by the fact that we haven't had some sort of, preliminary official announcements. With the NBA announcing just recently that they're going to tip on December 22nd, and they got all their ducks in a row: free agency, training camp, sprinkled in a nice financial incentive to bring the players back earlier. They got their stuff buttoned down in a hurry, and it was interesting to me that because the NHL typically kind of follows the NBA's lead on stuff like this, and I was just blown away that we haven't heard something by now.
I don't know if I'm surprised or not. I think what surprised me is how well the NHL did the Stanley Cup playoffs. That surprised me. That still surprises me. So this kind of dysfunction and foot dragging and stumbling, I won't lie. I expected more of that before the playoffs. I'm not shocked at the moment. Maybe I should be, but I'm not.
Well, unfortunately, the window is closing. Gary Bettman initially announced it. The plan was to play exactly. The plan was to play a full season of games, and he had bantied about end of January, beginning of December. But I mean, just looking at it from a logistics standpoint, that ship's already sailed. I mean, that had to be lip service only for the fans and advertisers. Um, what I'm hearing now is it'll probably be a 48 game schedule that will begin on February 1st. Um, that's the latest that I'm hearing.
So 2 months from now, they got 2 months to get their act together, play 48 games. Well, the 95 season had 94, 95 had 48 games. And I feel like they started about January 20th. I'm not sure. And then they went way into June with the Stanley Cup final that the Devils won. So I think that's possible. But again, they're playing into summer, which I don't know that they wanted to do. I remember Gary Bettman saying he didn't want to do that, but I guess they don't have a choice now.
Well, and they do have a hard out this year because of the Olympics. If the Olympics go off, NBC has a commitment here in the United States, and to cover that. So, and CBC would in Canada as well. So there is a clock running on it for sure. I think 48 game schedule on February 1st is doable. Obviously, it's not what we all want, and they're certainly going to have to make a lot of concessions to get that many games in that short amount of time. And the first thing that I'm hearing, Steve, is a divisional realignment, obviously, because with COVID and transborder travel not happening and quarantining, and whether it's 14 days or 10 days or 7 days or whatever it's at now, is not realistic. That the NHL will realign. There's already been talk of a Canadian division, which I think obviously has to be a real thing. But if we take a look at the divisions, it's pretty fun to see how they break down, and perhaps some of the new rivalries that may be created or not. The Canadian division pretty much speaks for itself. Any surprises there for you, Steve, or anything?
No, I think there should be a Canadian division. There should have been a Canadian division in the NHL forever. I think the World Hockey Association had a Canadian division. I would be happy to see a Canadian division every single year. I'm still ticked off that the NHL office isn't in Canada anymore. So don't get me started on Canada.
Okay, that sounds like that's another YouTube video for another time.
Could
Uh,
be.
moving on to the East. I mean, those are all pretty much the usual suspects. including my beloved Carolina Hurricanes in the middle of all that. Lots of natural built-in rivalries there with the New York teams and the Flyers and the Caps and Bruins Sabres. Um, there was some things that struck me as odd in the Central, Steve. Uh, Number one is the Stanley Cup champion Lightning, and but more specifically, the Pittsburgh Penguins in the Central Division. Thoughts?
Yeah, you'd have thought they'd be in with the Flyers, but the problem is when you got to balance the divisions, you're always going to have more teams in the East because there was no NHL team west of the Mississippi River until the St. Louis Blues and the LA Kings came in '67. It was all Eastern. So, and I don't count the St. Louis Eagles way back in 1930, whatever. So you got to have some teams that are in divisions they don't belong in, but you got to have Tampa in the same division as Florida. And I guess Pittsburgh is the one that gets slightly misplaced.
Yeah, and then if you look at the West, the two that jump out at me there are Minnesota and Dallas, because they're both in the Central Time Zone. So you know, my only concern there would be with a condensed schedule and multiple games, like 3-4 games a week with travel. I just feel that that's an unfair advantage to teams like LA, Anaheim, and San Jose that have 45-minute. You can either drive down the freeway or you can take a 30-minute flight up to San Jose as opposed to having a flight at Dallas or Minnesota. So those ones jump out at me as being odd.
I think that gets talked about a lot. Lots of travel. Um, I don't think it's such a big deal anymore with charters, especially in this time because there really are going to be charters. Some teams got to be in the West. For years, it was the Detroit Red Wings, and they're not in the Western. They're not even in Western Michigan. So, uh, to me, having the Wild and the Stars there, some teams have to go in there. Seattle's not in yet, or that would solve half that problem. So, that kind of makes sense to me. The West.
So that's a look at the now again we're not in any NHL boardroom meetings, so this is just based on the information that's sort of been leaked out. So this is not hard and fast rules by any stretch of the imagination. But one thing that is in cement is when the NHL does return to play, you can bet your life savings that the broadcasts are going to look different. What I'm hearing is that teams will play in their home arena with no fans. Um, but what won't travel is visiting television. So let's just use my example. I direct the broadcast for the Carolina Hurricanes. When the Hurricanes play in New York to face the Rangers, I will not be in New York. I will stay in Raleigh, and I will take a host feed or a world feed from MSG Network, the home broadcaster for the Rangers, and I will have one of my own cameras that we can use to tell our Carolina-centric stories on the whistle.
How is that different than the playoffs? You were at home. Oh, but you had more sources.
Yes, exactly. In the playoffs, we had like 7, 8, 9, 10 sources that we could come down. So I could take the game camera clean. I could take tight follow clean. I could take the visiting ISO clean. The clean wide shot. They had the clean G to jib that was available if we wanted to take it. And I mean, it's buyer beware. Obviously, you roll a dice when you're cutting in uncontrolled sources. But this is completely different. This is going back to, I don't know. This is like going back to the way the broadcasts were done 40 years ago. Uh, back in the early 80s and mid 80s, visiting networks would pull in and they would take a feed from the home show and they'd have one or two of their own cameras and you got what you got. And that's what we're headed for this season.
Yeah, what would happen in the '80s was, let's say the Minnesota North Stars would come into Edmonton, and they wouldn't even rent their own truck. They'd be in our truck on a back deck, and their producer, it was just him and the two commentators were usually the only travel crew. They didn't even send a technical person. He would have a small switcher in front of him with about 6 buttons on it, and he could control one or two cameras that he could take. He couldn't control the camera. He couldn't tell the operator to pan or zoom, but he could take cameras on the whistle that he had into that small switcher. So if on the whistle, let's say for ITV, because we're in Edmonton, we're going to do a next game promo, I would say to their producer, you got to get off us on the whistle. So he'd cut to a high wide shot, couldn't dissolve or anything, just a straight cut, bang.
Yeah.
He'd tell his announcers, just talk about something while we're on this wide shot. and we'd do our promo. We'd finish. We'd go back to play. I'd say, you can join us again. And he'd punch back to our game feed. So to do that now in 2020, that's borderline barbaric, but that's how it was done then. And it looked fine, for Minnesota North Stars hockey in the 1980s, because they were just happy to watch a game from Edmonton. Not now. That's all changed.
Right? Oh no, that's prehistoric television compared to what it's done, how it's executed now. I mean, home shows, and we're talking regional broadcasts now, not what you're seeing on Hockey Night in Canada or NBC Sports. Right. But regional broadcasts are, weighted 95% home team, 5% other guys, right? I mean, no matter who we play every night, the other team is the Washington Generals. So I don't know how they're going to execute that. I think there's going to have to be some sort of broadcast philosophy mandate from the league offices in New York to say, hey, you guys, you have to be a little bit more balanced in your coverage, because I just don't see us sitting in Raleigh taking a Ranger-centric feed and trying to do our Carolina Hurricane show on that.
And when you say balanced in your coverage, player goes in, makes a save. It's the home goalie who makes the save. They come out of the whistle with a series of replays, and it's all home team centric. You got to mix in some of the visiting team there. Otherwise, their commentators are just seeing this home team that they don't necessarily want to see. It has to be more balanced. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about balanced, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that could come up as well, too, is there are some color commentators in the NHL that live and die with Telestrator. And then there's some that don't touch Telestrator, and they're just big picture kind of story guys. So if you're a big picture story guy and every replay sequence you're getting from the home show is the end zone Telestrator, look, here's how the play broke down. That doesn't give you many pictures to talk about, big story, big picture, player profile stuff, neat stories. It's from A to Z effects, from a broadcast philosophy standpoint, with depending on how they end up doing these shows. It's going to be very interesting to see how it's done.
Do you think the guy at home will care? I think he probably will care. Like, I don't think you want to go and watch the Oilers play in Toronto and you're in Edmonton and all we're seeing is Leafs, 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 because Canada gets enough Leafs. I understand that. And we don't need more Leafs. But I don't know how that broadcast is going to be balanced. I think viewers are going to have a lot of patience. They'll be excited to watch the games, but we're into the second group of last year's playoffs and now this regular season where it's just not the television you're used to seeing on a home broadcast.
No, at that point, I think hockey fans just have to be, grateful that they're are games, and B, that you're able to see them on TV. But certainly lower your expectations in terms of seeing your team the way that you're used to seeing them, or the way that you want to see them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anything else we didn't touch on, my friend?
No, I think that's it. I'm just excited to hear some news tomorrow, the next day. We're already creeping into December, and hockey, like for myself, as for everybody else, can't come back soon enough.
No, me neither. Hopefully the World Juniors gets played as we record this. I'm not even positive that's going to happen in Edmonton starting on Christmas Day. I think I'd be happy with a February 1st 48 game schedule. I'm not positive it's going to happen. To me, it's a coin flip. What do you think the odds are that they're going to have a season this year?
I think it's 100% they're going to have a season. I don't think that they can miss. I think they'll find a way to make it work. The NBA is finding a way to do it. So hopefully they can share some of their wisdom with the NHL. But I think it's a critical mistake if they don't find a way to make it work. So I'm 100% confident there will be a season. I really just think that it's going to be a lot shorter than we all want, and it's unfortunately going to start a little bit later into the winter than we all want.
You know what? If it's shorter, the games mean more. I'm okay with that. So that's NHL Return to Play, YouTube style on Inside the Truck. I'm Steve. He's Paul. We'll see you on the podcast and see you next time on YouTube.